Hi, I'm Mark Gaylor, Sony Global Imaging Ambassador. You've joined me for the Sony Alpha Focus Masterclass, and this is where we're going to learn how to take pin-sharp images each and every time. Okay, so let's proceed. Now you can join up with me after this presentation by going to my website, markgaylor.com, and this is where you're going to be able to watch additional movies and also access lots of ebooks that you can download, and everything on this website is absolutely free. Okay, so let's proceed. Now, the famous photographer Ansel Adams once said that the single most important component of a camera is the 12 inches behind it. Now, Sony make amazing, sophisticated cameras, but they're really only as good as the ability for the user, the photographer, to be able to drive this technology. So we're going to learn how to get the best settings for each and every photograph that we intend to shoot. Now, just a little bit of knowledge can help us make intelligent choices about focus. Now, focus isn't a single setting on a Sony Alpha camera, it's a series of settings, and this would include focus mode, focus area, drive mode, or whether we're using the lock-on AF feature, the priority settings for focus, track sensitivity, and whether we choose to be a back button AF user or not. And with the right combination of settings, we're going to be able to get critically sharp images even under the most challenging of situations. Now, we are going to be able to program memory or custom buttons and register custom shoot settings to make this very easy to do once we've applied these settings. So it may seem a lot of information, but we're just one button press away from getting these quick settings which are ultra reliable. Okay, we're also going to be looking at the best manual focus settings using Sony Alpha cameras, and trust me, it's going to be a lot easier than employing 12 guys to shift the focus on one of these historical cameras that you can see in this image. Okay, so let's start by just looking at a little bit of a side topic here, which is depth of field. Now, some of you may already understand all there is to understand about depth of field, but let's just make sure that we're all on the same page here. We're talking about the zone of acceptable sharpness in a photo that will appear in focus, or simply stated, how much of my image will be blurry and how much will be sharp. Now, this is a great image for explaining depth of field because we can quite quickly ascertain the plane of focus in this image, and everything that is behind this plane of focus or in front of this focus will get progressively softer or out of focus. And being able to position that plane of focus quickly and accurately is obviously a secret to our success when using the autofocus systems. Now, there are many factors that influence depth of field, and these are aperture or f-stop, the distance of the camera to the subject, how close we are, the focal length of the lens that we're choosing to use, the size of the sensor, and also the viewing size and the distance we are away from that view. Okay, now all of these combined will influence how much of the image appears sharp to the human eye. Okay, and once we've learned those factors, we can actually use them to our creative advantage. In this image captured with a Sony FE12-24 lens, I'm using this at the widest 12mm focal length, and with an appropriate choice of aperture, i.e. a small aperture such as f11 or f16, we can get deep focus right from in front of where I'm standing right through to the horizon line or infinity. And by using an alternative sequence of settings, we can exploit very shallow depth of field. Here I'm using a short telephoto lens, an 85mm lens, at the widest aperture, which is f1.8. And here only the eyes are critically sharp on this monkey being groomed in barley. Okay, and so quickly, when we know how to choose those appropriate settings, we can really dictate the narrative or story behind our images. Here I'm creating what's called a 3D pop effect by making the background simply blur out, so the viewer's attention is focused only on the subject that I want you to view. Now this is again shot with a short telephoto lens, an 85mm lens at an f1.8 aperture. Now, aperture and focal length combined are our major tools for choosing how much of our image is sharp. Now, in the landscape genre, for instance, we're often using ultra wide angle lenses, and when we're choosing apertures of f11 or f16, we can get things that are very, very close to the camera lens, right through to infinity pin sharp. And we're going to be looking at the techniques that we can use in order to ensure that we get that each and every time. Now this is in the same location as the previous shot. I'm only using an average aperture of f8, but just combining this with a 100-400 telephoto lens at the maximum focal length, the 400mm focal length, and a teleconverter, pushing that focal length out to 560mm, we can see we can get figure ground separation, the subject sharp, the background very blurry, just by using an aperture of f8, but combining that with a choice of focal length. Now, macro photographers are very aware of the factor of distance to your subject for influencing depth of field, and the closer we go to the subject, the less of the subject is going to be critically sharp. Depth of field becomes very narrow in macro photography. This was captured with a 90mm macro lens on a full frame, and just that factor of using a full frame sensor also reduces the depth of field compared to, say, a crop sensor such as an APS-C sensor. One of the factors we have to be wary of is as we approach a subject, maybe with a short telephoto, our chosen aperture, maybe 1.8, which is great for creating figure ground separation, may not be ideal when we're wanting to get multiple subjects sharp. Here in this instance, I'm having to stop down 3 stops or more to get all of these 3 monkeys acceptably sharp. And even then, the monkey in the top left hand corner is just starting to go a little bit soft around the eyes. Okay, so one of the factors obviously that influences that depth of field, proximity or distance to your subject. We can't underrate how much we need to stop down in order to get all of our subjects critically sharp. Okay, another factor that influences how much we perceive as sharp is the size of the image that we're viewing. And if you start editing on a small laptop and then display your images on a big 4K TV or monitor, you might be surprised to see that your images aren't as actually sharp as you thought they might be. And so I would always advise that you edit images on quite a large, high-resolution monitor, just to be sure that what you're seeing is sharp is what other people will see as sharp as well. Okay, so sensor size, we've discussed this already, but full frame sensors have a narrower depth of field at the same aperture compared to a crop sensor. If you are on a crop sensor, such as an A6000, 6300, 6500 camera, you are going to have to open up one extra aperture in order to get the same narrow depth of field as a full frame user. And obviously with landscape it works the other way. You're not going to have to stop down quite as much to get that deep depth of field. You might find you're only stopping down to f8 or f11, whereas a full frame user might be having to stop down to f11 or f16 in order to get that depth of field that they require for deep focus. Okay, one of my number one pieces of advice for users when working with the autofocus systems is basically choose a focus area as large as possible and only come smaller if and when needed. I have found quite a few users starting out with a spot focus and having trouble getting reliable sharp images. Some people will often take advice that the single spot is the most accurate. And when it might actually be the most accurate in some instances, but it is very difficult to put that single spot on subjects that are moving quite quickly. And so that does lead to unexpected, unsharp images. So my number one advice really is to start wide. The wide AF area is actually the default focus area for users using the auto scene settings inside of the camera that we can access through the auto mode. Now, a wide focus area in an instance like this is absolutely ideal. Okay, it's going to look at the subject no matter where it is in the frame and choose to get that sharp. Now, the wide does focus subjects that are close and also subjects that are close to the center over other subjects that might appear. And this is how the camera will choose which subject to focus on. Now, in 90% of instances, most photographers are actually photographing something that is reasonably central and close to the camera. And so that is why wide is predictably reliable in most, if not all, instances. Okay, so let's take a look at some of the other focus areas that we can actually choose when we're not choosing the wide focus area. Here is an example of a spot focus being positioned unreliably over an area of smooth continuous tone. Now, what the spot is actually looking for in order to be able to snap the focus sharp is actually a line, an edge, and it actually favors vertical edges over horizontal edges. So if we were just to position that spot focus over a vertical edge such as the tie there, we're going to get a much more reliable and quicker autofocus. Having said that, in my own work, I would just simply come down from perhaps a wide focus area to a zone focus area if we have subjects that are a little bit closer than our primary subject. Here you'll see that I'm nailing focus very quickly and reliably, even though there is a guy either side of the subject that is actually closer. And just to make sure the camera prioritizes center and close within that zone, I'm just reducing that focus area a little into that zone. Okay, so that would be my most reliable autofocus area in this instance. I would actually come down to spot occasionally. Here I'm shooting over the shoulder of somebody and I'm trying to put that area of focus. It's no longer front and center that I'm looking for. I'm going into the middle distance here and I'm specifically looking for a target for the camera to focus on. And so in this instance, I'm going to come down from my zone into a flexible or variable spot focus. Okay, so one of the things that when we're looking at our images to decide whether we actually nailed the focus or not is there are many sorts of blur. It's not just whether the camera was out of focus. We can get the subject blurring because the subject is moving, or we can get the camera moving in the hands, leading to something called camera shake. And so we have to be able to identify in what instances the camera was actually focused accurately, but either the subject or the camera is moving and the shutter speed is unreasonably slow for what it is we're trying to capture. This is an example of that. For instance, the building is pin sharp, but the shutter speed is not actually fast enough to freeze the cyclist in motion. And so in this instance, we can either choose to do two things. We can either pan the camera with the cyclist, or we can increase the shutter speed so we can freeze that motion. And in this instance, it's not about focus, it's more about shutter speed in order to get that critical focus. Okay, so one of the settings that I would encourage most people to use most of the time is a setting that I use called auto ISO rather than a fixed ISO setting. Because if we're letting the camera raise its ISO to protect the shutter speed from going too slow, that is a much more reliable way of getting very sharp images more often. Now, typically what I would also encourage, especially full frame users to do, is to raise the minimum shutter speed just a little. Some people using a 50mm lens would typically let the shutter speed go as slow as a 50th of a second to avoid something called camera shake. That's the camera moving in your hands. But often this doesn't protect you from the subject moving slightly. And so in this instance, with this subject who's actually sitting on a horse, I'm going to raise the minimum shutter speed up to 1/160th of a second or faster to allow for the subject to move slightly as I'm taking their camera. Now you will also notice that in the auto and program modes that maybe newcomers to photography will use, that would be typically the lowest shutter speed setting that the cameras will go down to 1/160th of a second. And again, that protects the new user from things like camera shake or slowly moving subjects being photographed. Okay, now when I'm on the online forums, a lot of photographers are often saying, so what's the best setting? And I often have to say, the best setting for what? Because there is no one group of settings that is best for all things that you're wanting to photograph. It's just an unreasonable expectation. Okay, so we have to create groups of settings that are appropriate for the subject that we're photographing. And you'll notice on my Alpha Creative Skills YouTube channel, I break down camera settings into genres of photography, whether it be landscape, portrait, action, or whether we're configuring settings for making movies. They all require a slightly different group of settings for those instances. Okay, so my advice here is the best settings. One group of best settings just simply don't exist. Okay, so as we learn about the focusing systems of the camera, it pays to learn a little bit about how the camera is working. This educates us to those instances where the camera will not be able to achieve sharp focus for one reason or another, because you understand the limitations of the focusing systems that we're working with. Now, on the Sony Alpha cameras, and in fact most interchangeable lens cameras, they use two different focusing systems. One is contrast detect autofocus and the other is called phase detect autofocus. And you'll often see these referred to by their acronyms CDAF or PDAF. Now, the CDAF, or the contrast detect autofocus, is primarily used when we're dealing with single shooting mode, AF-S. You'll see that listed on the camera. And when we are working with fast-moving subjects and we're working with continuous AF, then the camera is primarily using the phase detect autofocus. In many instances, the Sony cameras are using a hybrid of both focusing systems, but that generally is gives you an overview of when one system is being used more than the other to achieve sharp focus. Now, CDAF is very accurate, but it's also very slow. Again, it's looking for a high contrast edge, and the way CDAF works, it tends to go beyond the edge and then comes back to actually double check to see whether it's got the sharpest position for that lens setting. But that does mean that it's a little bit slow, and it's primarily used in a situation where your subject is static, such as portraiture or a studio setting. Now, the PDAF is a very interesting area for Sony because it's basically driven most of the recent Sony technologies that we see on their sensors. Now, when Sony acquired the Konica Minolta plant, they acquired DSLR technology, mirrors that move, and also PDAF sensors that are housed in the mirror chamber of the camera. Now, Sony immediately realized that the mirror was going to hold them back from development of camera systems, because when the mirror moves out of the way to take an image, the PDAF sensor that tracks fast-moving subjects is temporarily blinded as that mirror is out of the way of the sensor. And so generally what happens with DSLR technologies is they lose the subject momentarily and then have to reacquire the subject when the mirror is back in place. So this led Sony to change their technology slightly by fixing the mirror and making the mirror translucent. This did steal away a third of a stop of light from the sensor, but it did mean the PDAF sensor had constant acquisition of the subject, which would enable it to track more reliably. Now, so we had these autofocus systems on the Sony SLT single lens translucent cameras, and the way that PDAF actually works is it uses divided sensors to see the world in stereo, just like the way we see depth with the human vision with two eyes, not one. And this allows us to have depth perception. PDAF also gives cameras depth perception. So instead of seeing a single subject from a single point, they actually see the subject from dual points. And this allows the cameras to pull focus quickly and accurately. The PDAF sensor communicates with the lens and drives the lens to retain focus even on rapidly moving subjects. And this subject you're looking at now is traveling at just subsonic speed, maybe something like 15,000 kilometers an hour. And an A7R II, which was not noted as a sports camera, is tracking this actually quite reliably. Okay, so interestingly, when the Sony mirrorless cameras came out, the very first Sony mirrorless cameras had no PDAF sensor at all. They actually lost the mirror, but they also lost the PDAF sensor. But we didn't have to wait too long to see where Sony was going with this technology, because even way back in the NEX days, before these cameras were called Alpha cameras, Sony started building PDAF technology, phase detect autofocus, directly onto the sensor, rather than having a separate sensor that looked after continuous autofocus. Now, the early iterations were quite slow, but we didn't have to wait too long before this technology matured and came of age. Now, I do have to point out some of the early E-Mount cameras where they simply don't have any PDAF sensors or ability to track fast-moving subjects, and these are the original A7R camera, and both the A7S and A7S2 cameras have no phase detect autofocus. So they're actually quite poor choices if fast-moving subjects is one of the areas that you want to photograph. They do have the very accurate contrast detect autofocus, and you can track things by using manual focus, but you can't expect these cameras to track continuous autofocus at all quickly. And some of the early cameras that did have on-sensor phase detect autofocus, such as the original A7 and then the subsequent A7 II, the technology was maturing, but it still wasn't fast enough to track fast-moving subjects. Okay, so my Alpha PDAF heroes, the ones that can be used for sports, action, fast-moving wildlife, are the cameras listed here, and any subsequent cameras that are released after I make this movie. They include the A6300, the 6500, both A99s, the SLT cameras, the A7 III, the A7R II and A7R3, and the hero of fast action cameras, the A9. Now, I would have included the A6000 on this list as well, because it does have fast autofocus on sensor. okay, the PDAF on sensor, but it did have a two-step system for locking on and then tracking, which made it a little bit difficult to acquire the subject and then track and shoot that subject in motion. This two-step system was relegated or fast-tracked into a single half press of the shutter release and then start shooting on the A6300. Okay, so and this allowed us to now shoot very fast moving action that's coming towards the camera. Photographers have always been able to pan even with manual focus cameras, but having the cameras to be able to track subjects that are changing their distance to the camera constantly and quickly is an area where we do need fast phase detect autofocus. And this is a great delight now to use these mirrorless cameras because I can track all manner of fast moving subjects, and dogs running is one of my favorites, it has to be said. And this is a series or a sequence of 20-30 images that are all pin sharp with no out of focus images. And we're going to be looking later in this tutorial about how we can set up the cameras to do this. Okay, before we go there though, let's backtrack and look at one of the ways that I would set up my focus system for landscape genre. Now this is an area where we don't need the fast PDAF technologies because our subject is not moving and often the camera is on a tripod. Okay, so it's just a matter about where in the scene do we focus. Now we know that small apertures will extend the depth of field, and especially when used in conjunction with a wide angle lens. Let's take a look at where in the scene we would be the most appropriate place to focus. But before we go there, I just need to point out that the steady shot inside that on the most recent E-Mount cameras does allow us to photograph landscape without the camera being mounted on a tripod. I can actually hand hold 1/5 of a second on an ultra wide angle lens. This is taken with a Batis 18mm lens, and actually no, sorry, that's a Batis 25, and I'm using an aperture of f11. Now I am hand holding that at 1/5 of a second reliably, and the foreground information is only 2 or 3 feet away from me, and the depth of field will extend right out to the Queen Mary 2 that we can see in the distance there. Okay, so also another example, again with that Batis 25mm, again shooting at the first light of day. I'm stopping down to f11 so I get my depth of field, but I'm still hand holding at 1/5 of a second. Now it's worth testing your own abilities to hand hold the camera, and I would encourage you not just to shoot a single image. I would shoot 2, 3 or 4 images at this slow shutter speed to see whether you can hand hold. Now depending on how much coffee you drink, some people may not be able to go this slow, and some people might even be able to go slower, 1/4 a second. Some people I've heard can even hand hold 1/2 a second or a second, but because I'm a coffee drinker, I typically won't go below 1/5 of a second handheld. So, and when I do go below that 1/5 of a second, the camera will be mounted on a tripod. Now, my favorite tripod that I like to carry all of the time, simply because they fit in my back pocket, are these little, they're often referred to as tabletop tripods, but I very rarely, if ever, put them on a tabletop. These often go to the ground. They keep the camera very low because the legs are very, very short, but this is my favorite vantage point for landscape. It brings the foreground into the shot. And so this typical tripod that you're seeing in this picture is a Pixie by the company Manfrotto, and they make an Evo version, which is the one pictured here, with lens that do extend. These are actually ideal for the light E-mount cameras, and can even the Evo version of this will even support a zoom lens without you having to put sandbags on the legs to stop the tripod from falling over. Okay, so let's go into the settings that I'm using here. I'll go into the AF tab. That's the fifth page in the first camera settings, and I'll set the focus mode to manual. Now this might be quite surprising for some, but I actually find it the quickest and easiest to implement. I'm not using manual focus because I'm a purist. I'm using it simply because it's the fastest focusing technique that I can use, that is the most reliable. Okay, so I'm going to take you to a depth of field calculator, which you can find on the website Cambridge in Colour, and that is using the British or English spelling of the word colour there. So remember to put in the U when you type out colour. It just shows you that when I set a particular distance, a manual focus distance, I am going to get that very deep depth of field when using a wide angle lens. In this instance, I am actually using the settings of the 18mm Batis here, and you can see that with an aperture of f16, everything from 1 meter to infinity, so long as I've set that 5 meter distance in manual focus, is going to be sharp. And I've actually increased the viewing size to double, just because I want that to be critically sharp for people who view on large screens or when I print very large. Okay, so often this is referred to as the hyperfocal distance, the ability to find the focusing distance that gives us acceptably sharp images from very close to the lens right through to infinity. Okay, I do have a separate movie on this on my Alpha Creative Skills YouTube channel. It's only a 90-second movie, but it shows you how incredibly quick it actually is to ascertain the appropriate vantage point, or a focusing distance, I should say, when trying to get critical sharpness from things that are very close to the lens right through to infinity. And why the reason it's so easy on an E-mount camera is we're actually previewing the scene through the closed down aperture. So we're actually previewing the depth of field. And so when we have the ability to magnify the view in the viewfinder, we can actually see that when we've pulled the focusing distance forwards, we can magnify the view and actually see whether the horizon is still critically sharp. And so it's very quick to find the optimum focusing distance. And sometimes this is important when we're not using those ultra wide angle lenses. Okay, so let's take a look at my focus settings for portraiture. Now, typically I am not using those closed down apertures of f11 and f16. I'm using sometimes the widest apertures on the lens to give me that figure ground separation, that 3D pop that a lot of people have fallen in love with. Okay, so the first settings that I really would guide you towards is IAF, especially on the later model cameras. It is so reliable for 95% of the instances that we're using. It gives us the ability to snap focus almost instantaneously, even though we have a very shallow depth of field, because it focuses on the leading eye in that figure. Okay, so we don't have to acquire the subject very quickly at all. It's going to do this in a nanosecond, literally. This woman has only just glanced at me. The camera is only at my face for a split second, and I've managed to reliably focus on this. And when we get very close to our subjects, we're always going to ensure the eyes are the key focal point in the image, because when we're working at with an f1.8 or 1.4 aperture, you're only going to have the eyes sharp. The tip of the nose and the ears are going to be already quite soft, but this is part of the attraction of that look, is just to work with very, very shallow depth of field. Okay, and so I take these portraits with only a couple of seconds. I don't like to make my sitters feel uncomfortable. This is an editorial style of portraiture, so I'm generally having conversation, the camera gets raised, I snap IAF, I have a custom button set up for IAF, and this is going to be a very hit and run, a very reliable technique for nailing focus 95% of the time. Now, if you don't have one of these wide aperture prime lenses, I often shoot with an 85mm prime at 1.8 or 2.8. You can still get that shallow depth of field. This is with a 24-70 lens at the 70mm focal length at f4 or f2.8 aperture. You can still get the shallow depth of field at f4 if you work very close to your subject like I am working here. Okay, and this is the depth of field that we can achieve by using an 85 1.4 lens. And one of the great things about the reliable IAF now is IAF can also detect the eye interface in profile view, where the older models would bow out because it doesn't see the two eyes in the face, so it doesn't recognize it as a face. Now the newer models are much more reliable, where the subject turns into profile view and IAF continues to track most of the time. Okay, surprisingly, and I have been surprised, is IAF will often pull focus behind sunglasses or even a dark pair of goggles. In this instance here, I am sometimes amazed when IAF still finds the eye in a face, even though with the human eye I'm having trouble working out where the eye is. Okay, so IAF on the very latest firmware upgrade for the A7R3, A9, and with the new A7 III, IAF now will work with face detect on, and in single you'll see the eye just pop in very momentarily in single shooting mode without us holding down a custom button to instigate IAF. IAF will automatically kick in now to help you. Okay, so but my love of IAF is to not to actually work in single focus mode, but into continuous focus. And this allows me to track with IAF when a subject is moving quite quickly, such as this guy on horseback riding towards me across a rodeo arena. And IAF is absolutely the most reliable way to track the subject in this instance. Okay, now if you're looking in the menus for IAF, you're going to be hunting a long time because it doesn't actually have a designated menu in the menu systems. You're only going to see IAF appear when you go to the custom key settings. By default, it's set to the center button on the control wheel there. I'll just ring it so you can see there. But we often, or most photographers often move it to a custom button that is either up to the top of the camera, such as the AEL button, or we'll move it on to the lens itself by using the focus hold button. Now, not all lenses have a focus hold button. The Zeiss designed lenses tend not to have one, but generally all of the telephoto lenses and the GM and G lenses do have that focus hold button. And this is my primary button for using IAF. Okay, so face priority in AF. Now, face priority is good for picking up faces, but we do need to discuss this because sometimes you might find yourself focusing on the wrong face, and also face priority may work against you in some instances. Okay, so on this particular camera, this is an A7R3. I'm going to find it on page 6 in the AF settings. You might find this on a different page on a different camera. So the face priority in AF, if we enter that page, you're going to see there's two options here. One is to switch it on or off, and the other one is to show which faces have been detected when you're viewing your scene. Now, I would typically switch both of these on, but I would also encourage you to set up a function menu item so you can disable face priority very quickly when face priority is working against you. And so I would go into the FN menus and set that up. Okay, and we'll maybe take a look at that a little bit later. Now here is an instance where the camera has picked up two faces. Now it's interesting to note that if I'm in an expand variable spot, that I can actually move the focus point to one of the faces and then hold down the IAF button, and it will pick the face nearest that variable spot. Okay, so this is a way of telling the camera which face you're prioritizing for IAF to pick that up. And so if I was to move the expand variable spot or flexible spot over to the face on the left and then held down the IAF button, it would snap focus on that face instead. So if you're, say, a wedding photographer, all you need to do is move your spot closest to the bride. It doesn't need to be anywhere near the eye, just to the bride's face, and then the IAF will do the rest. Now you will find IAF is ultra reliable in some surprising instances. Even say behind like some netting here, the IAF will still pick that up. And if you're not telling the camera which face, it will go for the eye that's nearest the camera. Okay, so another way of telling the camera which face to go for is face registration. Now go into the face registration menu, and you can then start registering a specific face. Now again, a wedding photographer might register the bride's face at the beginning of the wedding, so the camera is always faithful to the bride if the bride appears in camera. Okay, so you will need to switch that on as well as registering the faces, and then you'll be told that the camera has found a registered face because that the outline around that face will be colored magenta, telling you this is the registered face. Okay, one of the things that I have come to work with IAF is occasionally IAF will not kick in for one reason or another, and so you have to remember what you did before IAF was such a great feature. You need fallback settings, and so the fallback settings that I'm going to walk you through are the ones that I can activate in a split second should IAF not kick in. So rather than getting frustrated with the camera, I'm simply just going to go instantly to my fallback setting. And this is to implement DMF, direct manual focus, and I'll have focus assist switched on and focus peaking switched on as well to help me. Okay, I've just come back from Montana in the USA, and I was shooting a picture of this cowboy, Randy Ryman, and it was a very high contrast situation. This is the edited version of the file, but the shadow from his hat was much, much darker. And I think I've got an example there I can show you. Now IAF was being problematic here, so I instantly went to my fallback setting. Okay, I've just got a 10-second movie to show you that fallback setting in action. Basically, I'm going to go into DMF, I'm going to find focus, I'm going to move the focus ring on the lens to find critical focus and then take the image. And it's as quick or quicker than that. Okay, so you can assign DMF to a custom button, and I'll show you how to do that as well. You can also go into your function menu and just change the focus mode to DMF, maybe from continuous or single shooting. And this is going to quickly give you access to that fallback position. Now I would go into the menus and just check you've got focus assist switched on. This is where the camera will magnify the view as soon as you start turning the focus ring. Now you will have the shutter release half pressed so that you're telling the camera I am focused, but then this will then allow you to fine-tune the focus using the focus ring on the lens in magnified view. Now you can combine this with peaking, focus peaking. Focus peaking will put a color of your choosing over the edges that are in critical sharpness. And so I would switch this on. I would set the peaking level to high, and you can use red, yellow or white as your favorite peaking color. I avoid using white because I'm often looking for the catch light in the eye to light up as either red or yellow to tell me that I have found critical sharpness. Okay, so just to highlight that, I'll just quickly show you that in operation. Okay, so there we go, finding critical sharpness and then take the image, and it's as simple as that. Okay, one of the things that I wasn't able to show in that last movie because I'm recording through a screen recorder is the sharpness will be highlighted with your focus peaking color. In this instance, I've chosen yellow. Okay, so if you wanted to not have to go into the function menu and then select DMF, there is a faster way of quickly going into DFM mode, and this is the one that I choose. I go and assign a custom button to my registered custom shoot settings, and this is where I can simply hold down the AEL button and go into DMF button in at a moment's notice if IAF fails to kick in. So you'll find this by going into your menus and going to the Register Custom Shoot Settings on this A7R3. I found it on the third page. Okay, so you can select up to 10 settings to register. Now, if there's any settings that you don't want to override, when you press your custom button, you can simply deselect the checkbox. So you're going to use all of the current settings, and you can only choose, and you can then only choose the settings that you do want to kick in. Now you can limit this to DMF, or you could change your focus area. And you could also have the AEL button instigate focus as well, so it behaves like a back button focus. So I've got those three selected, and then I will come down after selecting DMF, and I will be sure to register those settings. Okay, it's more than that single step, however. You will then have to go over to your custom key. This is in the second camera menu in one of the later tabs, I think 8, page 8 or 9 on that on those menus. You're going to come down to your custom key shoot settings and then reprogram a custom button. Now I like to reprogram the AEL button. It's very close to my thumb, and so I can hold that down at a moment's notice to go into those settings. Okay, so those are my fallback settings for portraiture. If you do a lot of portraiture and you mix between horizontal and vertical format, sometimes referred to as portrait and landscape formats, then it is worth noting that you can assign different focus points depending on the orientation of the camera. And so you'll find this in this AF menu setting. It's got quite an abbreviation, so it may not be immediately obvious what this menu item actually does, which is probably why I'm explaining it to you. That is short for Switch Vertical Horizontal Autofocus Area. And I've set it to AF point and AF area. And what will then happen is if I'm using horizontal mode and I've assigned my a spot focus to top right, then when I rotate the camera, I'll be able to assign a different focus point to top right. So now I can keep changing the orientation of the camera, and I will maintain that top right focus position no matter what orientation the camera is in, and so that is great. And if you orientate the camera vertically in two different ways, you actually have a third option there, so you're always maintaining top right as your primary focus point, or top left. Okay, so we can assign our favorite settings to a memory, and this is what I would encourage you to do. Once you've got groups of settings, I would encourage you to assign them to a memory, so you don't have to memorize everything that I'm saying in this movie tutorial. Now, one of the things that I would do, for instance, for my favorite portrait settings, which is shallow depth of field, I'm going to set them as a starting point of f2.8, but I'll often go wider or close down when I encounter multiple subjects. And just because I refer to them as my portrait settings, they're still appropriate for other styles of photography. So I'll often do a detail shot. This was just a few minutes after that I took that portrait shot of that cowboy, Randy Ryman, and here I'm going into a detail shot of a guy's hand on the saddle of his horse, and I'm still using the same portrait settings for this style of photography. Okay, where I tend to alter those settings, those portrait settings, which are optimized for a single shallow depth of field portrait, is when I'm taking pictures of multiple subjects and all subjects need to stay sharp. Now, if both subjects are exactly the same distance from the camera, you can still work with a relatively wide aperture. Here we've got two people that I perceive as being the same distance from the camera, and so I'm very nervous, however, of opening up any more than f4, to be honest. f4 should be able to get both subjects sharp if I think they're the same distance from the camera, even when I'm working close with a short telephoto lens such as the 85mm prime. If, however, I think the subject distance is now different, especially when this guy has taken a 3/4 stance to me, and I think that the child's head might be, say, a foot behind his head, then I'm going to start stopping down, and not just a little bit. I have I've learnt not to lose too many images because I didn't stop down enough. And so in this instance, I've actually stopped down 4 stops from my wide open f1.8 aperture here in order to make sure that both subjects are critically sharp. Okay, so let's take a look at subject distance when we are working close and macro photography. Now, if I'm working macro, one of the things that I will improve my focusing technique with is by simply using a macro lens, because other lenses do have a minimum focusing distance. So if you need to get very, very close to your subject, first check out whether you need to invest in a macro lens. For the full frame cameras, that could be the FE90 or the FE50mm macro there. Okay, one of the things you are going to notice about macro is the depth of field is very shallow, and even if you stop down, you don't pull that much more depth of field. Now, one of the problems with autofocus in these instances is when the cameras are primarily trying to shoot things that and prioritize things that are center and close. If you're not moving into a spot focus, you can find the camera starting to focus on the leading edge of, say, this butterfly or moth, rather than pushing back to the hero, which is the eyes of this insect. And so typically what I would do is if you can't reliably place that focus quickly, I would start using manual focus. I actually find it, again, just like with landscape, I actually find it easier to use manual focus. The macro lenses aren't noted for very ultra fast focusing. They're not sports lenses. And so when they lose the subject and start hunting off to infinity and then have to try and come back, it can be very frustrating, and you have to be very patient while waiting for the lenses to gain critical sharpness again. And rather than right with that scenario, it's often better just to drop into manual focus. Maybe use the focus assist again, like we did with DMF, and start finding focus. Sometimes I will set a predetermined distance from my subject, and then just me physically lean in or lean out from the subject, looking for the focus peaking to kick in, and then I know I have critical focus. Some macro photographers will work with the camera on a monopod, so you can quickly lean in and lean out and get a little bit more stability with the camera being secured on a monopod. Okay, so, and these images were captured in that style, okay, giving me critical sharpness, not on the leading edge of the insect, but pushing the focus back a little bit towards the eyes. Okay, so I just captured this just a couple of weeks ago, a Columbia spotted frog in a little pool. If you were using autofocus, you would find that this might be reliable in this instance, but when the frog turns around and the leading edge of the frog is its snout, then I want to really push back to the eyes. And again, I find DMF is the most reliable way of doing this. The autofocus will find the frog, but then the manual focus override will allow me to push a little bit further back, so I get critical sharpness just where I need it with this instance here. Now, there is a focusing technique which relies on post-production, and that is something called focus stacking. This is appropriate for maybe pictures of mushrooms or fungi or insects that have died. Basically, the subject needs to be static. It does need a tripod, and basically you move the focus through your subject bit by bit, taking a whole series of images and then stacking focus in post-production. And so that is a technique you might want to explore if you need to extend the depth of field with macro photography. Okay, I often don't use macro lenses when I'm shooting small subjects. I tend to move closer with telephoto lenses, so I thought I'd just better outline this technique as an alternative approach to macro if your subject matter isn't really tiny. Okay, so this picture of a red squirrel is captured. It's uncropped. It's captured at the closest focusing distance of this 70 to 200 lens, and the closest focusing distance there is 78 centimeters. Okay, at the 200mm focal length, but this does allow me to get very tight to the subject. I'm actually shooting with this with a silent shutter, so I don't frighten this poor squirrel away, who senses my presence but doesn't really know if I'm there because I'm absolutely motionless. Another way is to shoot with that telephoto, and if you do encounter the closest focusing distance and you're not as close as you like, just remember on our megapixel rich cameras we can crop tighter in post-production. It's very rare that we need all 24, 36 or 42.4 megapixels from our cameras, so we can crop in. Okay, so for many instances we're only trying to get enough pixels to fill an Ultra HD TV or monitor, and that is simply 8.3 megapixels. So we do have that latitude when cropping. This is a no crop image, I have to say, and we could go much tighter again, but you can see I'm very close to this kangaroo, and this is again captured with a 70-200, this time at the 80mm focal length, and you can see how close I can actually go without using a macro lens. And this was captured with an 85mm prime. And even if we want to go even closer, a 100-400, the minimum focusing distance is actually pushing out a little bit. 1.5 meters, I think, is the minimum focusing distance. But because of the magnification factor of the 400mm, it does allow us to get incredibly tight crops on some wildlife that we're photographing, such as this rhino. or this very, very small frog which you could hold in the palm of one hand and actually close your fingers around without squashing the poor fellow. This is at the closest focusing distance, so 1.5 meters, 400 mil. No crop on the image again, and you can see how tight I can go without using a macro lens. And interestingly, a macro lens, the focusing would actually be more challenging than using the 100-400 telephoto in this instance. Okay, and this is the 100-400 used with a 1.4 teleconverter. This is now 560 millimeters, and this is a tight, uncropped image of this crocodile. Admittedly, the crocodile is behind barbed wire, so it's not getting to me, but you can see how close I can get into the subject detail, again, without using macro. Okay, so this is perhaps where not all cameras are equal. Certainly buying into a later model alpha camera is going to give you an edge. Action photography does require quite sophisticated systems, and the latest model alpha cameras have that in spades. Okay, I've always been fascinated with the moving image, and this and other people going back more than 100 years have shared this fascination. This is a sequence of images captured by Edward Muybridge in 1878 of a running racehorse, and he captured this just to show that a racehorse did in fact have all four hooves off the ground at any one time. And Edward Muybridge actually had to develop a shutter system for multiple cameras because he didn't have a camera that shot frames per second, and so he was great at being able to achieve that. I've shared this love of capturing the moving image ever since, and I do like to freeze my motion. I know I can pan with a little bit of subject blur, but I do like to freeze. And for most people who haven't got a great panning technique yet, and it's a bit like acquiring a good golfing swing, it does take a lot of practice, but what is a level playing field is if you raise the shutter speed, so you're using a very fast shutter speed, as long as you're using the right combination of settings, you can nail sharp focus. Now, one of the other critical factors to acquiring and keeping up with a fast-moving subject is to combine the sophisticated camera with a lens that can keep up with the camera. Now, these white lenses made by Sony can keep up with very fast-moving action. There are other lenses as well. For instance, I've shot fast-moving action with the 80 film 5mm prime, and that has been more than fast enough to keep up with fast-moving action as well. But certainly these telephoto zooms are very good at keeping up with the cameras. Okay, so one of the things I should mention about some of the settings on the lenses, there's actually a steady shot setting for on or off on the cameras. And when you switch steady shot off on the lens, it also switches it off in the camera. Now, steady shot, which is designed for maybe slow shutter speeds with the camera being held steady, will often fight against you when you're trying to move the camera to track fast-moving action. Now, if you're just going through a basic panning left to right, right to left sequence of images that are predictably moving in that sort of horizontal manner, then you can leave steady shot on, but you would need to switch the mode to mode 2, which disables some of the gyros that are trying to keep things steady. This is basically telling the camera or giving permission for you to pan without the camera trying to fight that and create a steady image. So mode 2 on the lens, it is actually my default mode, and I often have to remember to switch it back to mode 1 if I'm going to use steady shot for a low light ambient landscape, for instance. Okay, one of the great things about some of the recent model Alpha cameras is their exceptionally broad spread of autofocus points. On the A7 III and the A9 cameras, we have 693 AF points. If you don't have one of those cameras, you're still going to have probably more than 400 AF points on a recent model Alpha camera. And often Sony refer to this now as 4D focus. Now, to give you an example of why that spread of AF points is so useful in photography, this is a picture of a raptor that I shot in full flight. Now you can see the main focal point, the eyes of the raptor are very off-center. Now if you were trying to shoot this raptor in continuous autofocus and you had a typical DSLR spread of autofocus points, you would not be tracking this bird in flight successfully. You would basically be trying to now focus on the background because one of the challenges is keeping the focus point somewhere over your subject as it moves around the frame. And with a very broad spread of AF points, generally what is happening now, if we can keep it in the viewfinder, the camera will track it reliably. And so that is the usefulness of such a broad spread of AF points. To give you an example of how I use those AF points is I can also start the focusing off center. Because we have AF points that go out towards the edges of the frame, I can initiate the tracking process on the edge of the frame, and without panning the camera, I can have the bird launch into the viewfinder and the camera will track that across the screen because it's locked on to the subject on the edge. Okay, now a word about this type of photography that isn't often widely known, especially from people coming from DSLRs, and that is, and it's outlined in the manual, the user manual, but it's a page without pictures, and some people miss this information. But it basically says when the f value, the aperture value, is greater than f8, i.e. f11, f16 in continuous shooting mode, the focus is locked to the setting in the first shot. So if the subject is tracking closer to you, only the first shot, if you're capturing these at f11 or f16, is going to be sharp. The focus will be locked on that first image in the sequence. You need to be f8 and wider in order for the camera to track focus and shift the focus point in every subsequent image in the sequence. The only Alpha E-Mount Alpha camera that has an exception to this rule is the A9, which does allow you to stop down to f11 and continue that focus tracking. Okay, so there are more than just setting the camera up in continuous focus mode and having the drive mode set to continuous as well for shooting fast action sports. And we really need to look at those options so we get the best possible performance from our very sophisticated cameras. One of these is a setting called priority settings in AFS and AFC, and I'm most interested now in the phase detect priority here. Now by default it's set to balanced emphasis, but we can move that to either AF autofocus or release. Now, if you're missing the first shot in a sequence and you're wondering, I'm sure I initiated the burst of shots earlier than I'm seeing, when I'm importing those cameras into my computer, it's probably because the setting here is set to AF or balanced. Basically, the camera has to confirm autofocus before it starts taking a picture. Now, if you set it to release, or you're a back button AF shooter, i.e. you're pressing the AF on button before you start shooting, then you are ensuring that that first shot will appear on your memory card. And so I see it occasionally on the forums, and some people are unsure why they didn't get that first shot, and this is the setting that you need to go in and reconfigure. And if that first shot, even if it's maybe not confirmed focus, if you still need that shot, set it to release. Choosing an appropriate AF area, this is the really big one for getting really reliable, fast, continuous autofocus with sports, action and wildlife images. Okay, by default, I did say at the beginning of this presentation, my number one advice is to keep the AF area wide. Okay, there are some instances where you're going to come out of this, and this is where we'll cover these now. Okay, so let's give you some examples. If I'd set the AF area to wide in this instance, it's going to get a reliable burst of shots of this image who's just lost his board, is kite surfing and is now attempting to walk on water, which was unsuccessful, I do point out. Wide would be a great AF area. He is center, he is close, and wide is going to nail this pretty much every time without fail. Okay, again, the camera is going to take the dog that is closest to the camera and nearest the center, and if that is your choice, and usually it is, then again the AF area set to wide is going to be more than reliable for these type of events. Okay, again, birds in flight, wide AF area, it's fairly reliable that the bird is the main subject. It's going to be surrounded by background that is much further away, and again the camera will find and track that bird no problem. Okay, so let's take a look at one of the other options. It's also called wide. But if we go just one up, you'll come down to these options. They're called the lock-on AF options. Now, these are grayed out. They're not available in AFS. So if you do see them grayed out, you need to shoot into continuous focus in order to acquire these focus areas. And I'll tell you now why you need to use these lock-on rather than just the wide. Okay, here's a sequence of images. Now I'm locked on, and wide would have locked on to this as well without using the lock-on AF wide. And it would continue to track this even though it's gone a lot closer to the camera now, and we would still be getting reliable AF. But the cowboy has dismounted his horse, and the horse is just about to run in front of the camera. Now this is where wide would give up on the cowboy and pull out to the subject that is now front and center. And that front and center subject is the blurry horse there. But the lock-on has remembered that it's tracking a blue cowboy. And so it doesn't know it's a cowboy, but it does know about shape and color and tone. And so it's continuing to track that subject even though it's now not the central closest subject in the frame. And so that is where lock-on comes into its own. And I've just got a little movie that shows you that. Okay, so 22 images, all sharp, and the reason that the lock-on was so reliable is I went into another camera setting where I wanted the camera to be as faithful to the primary subject as possible. Now this is controlled by AF track sensitivity. Now we have a number of options here, and I have noticed some people changing it from standard to responsive, and they're not too sure why they're changing it, but responsive sounds such a good word that maybe that's the better of the options. Whereas in this instance on the movie you just watched, is the best option absolutely is the locked on option. This is set down at number 1 of the 5 options. This is basically telling the camera not to give up on the primary subject, even though the camera may think it's got a better camera, a more reliable target to go and track. Okay, so often if you're photographing wildlife and it doesn't matter which zebra, so long as a zebra is sharp, then maybe responsive is a good choice. But if you're tracking a particular subject, a particular player in a subject event, then having locked on is going to give you the most reliable results for the camera to stay with the initial subject. You may lose 1 or 2 frames, critical sharpness, but the camera will stay with your primary subject longer than responsive. Okay, so let's take a look at a lock-on AF wide error. Okay, now these dogs are running through long grass. Now, just by choosing to focus and shoot, you may not have disconnected your shutter release button from the focus. So typically you just half press, it locks onto something and then starts shooting. In this instance, it's locked on to the grass surrounding the dog, because when it started shooting, the grass was surrounding and was in front of the dog's chest. So front and center is often the choice the camera makes, and the whole sequence will stay with the grass. So the dog will progressively through the sequence just become blurrier and blurrier. Okay, so that is where wide was inappropriate in this instance. Okay, so in those instances where there is something in front of your subject or closer to the camera, you are going to reduce the focus area. I find it's probably only 10% of the instances, but you're going to come out of lock-on AF wide into lock-on AF expand flexible spot. Now try and maybe start the AF on sequence early, just to confirm. You'll see the little green squares around your subject if it's locked on. If it has locked on successfully, then start shooting. If it mysteriously locked on to some foliage or a tree or a nearby subject, just take your finger off the shutter release, reacquire the subject, and then start shooting. And if you are using the AF on button, just release the AF on, reacquire the AF on. As soon as you're confident that the subject is acquired, then start shooting. Okay, so I do find, as I say, I don't have to use it often, but knowing when the subject isn't front and center, this is when you're going to start reducing the focus area so that your sequences of images are more reliable to lock on. Okay, so lock on AF expand flexible spot. As the dog rises above the grass, that's when I'll choose to acquire the subject. So even when it descends into the grass, it's still going to remember some of the color, tone and shape of the dog, even though now the grass is front and center and the dog is in amongst the grass. So again, another successful sequence just by reducing the focus area in this instance. Okay, so lock on AF expand flexible spot would also be my primary choice for this example I showed area about the advantage of having a wide focus area. Okay, we've locked on. We're now tracking across the screen even though the bird has moved. Now in some instances you might find that when you're using a lock-on feature, the camera sometimes thinks that maybe the tree and the bird are one subject, so you can get instances where the camera gets confused because the subject has seemingly broken into two. Now I do have a different group of settings when subjects are stationary to when they're actually moving, and so we are going to cover that as a plan A, plan B type scenario for tracking subjects. Okay, here's another good example of when you might want to use a lock-on AF. Again, this cyclist, the young cyclist, is not front and center. So if you're tracking this cyclist, and you might have acquired the cyclist much earlier, but it will continue to track this cyclist rather than other cyclists, even when this cyclist isn't front and center anymore. I will often switch between two focus areas because one focus area might not be sufficient for the subject that I'm photographing. I'm going to have to alternate or toggle between two different focus areas. Now, there's something called autofocus area registration and recall. Okay, now if you switch this on in the menus, you can actually basically long press the function button and set that focus area into the memory bank. And then you can go away from that focus area but return to your registered focus area by holding down a custom key. Now I have set this up for custom button 3 as a toggle item here. Okay, so AF area is by default set to custom button 2, as we saw in a previous slide. But if I need to toggle that at a moment's notice between 2, I'm going to use my custom button 3 for that. So I'll go into my custom key shoot settings, come down to custom button 3 and set that for my register area, AF area toggle. Now you can set that to hold, but holding the custom 3 button on the top left side of the camera can be a little bit problematic when you're supporting a long telephoto zoom. So I will just set that to toggle, so I only have to press it once and return my hand to supporting the lens. And so now I can go from wide to spot just with a single custom button press. Okay, some people, and you may have heard this, some people, in fact it's almost a religion, some people belong to the back button AF shooters. Now, it is not critical for success with these recent model E-Mount cameras. You can simply just initiate focus before you start shooting by pressing the AF on button. But if you want to unlink the shutter release from any focusing duties, you can do that by going into the AF2 menu and simply switching AF with shutter to the off position. Now, I actually don't use this, but if you've come and that is your modus operandi for a long time from maybe a DSLR, then by all means use it. But I find that I get just the amount of performance by not unlinking the shutter release from the focusing system. Okay, so this is giving me ultra reliable focus over a whole series of shoots. Fast action I find is ultra reliable, and this is without using back button AF. I'm obviously not using IAF here. I can be using wide or my expand flexible spot to acquire these subjects. But in this instance, where subjects are not always moving, and especially if I'm using a camera such as the A9 and the subject is suddenly static, and I don't need to be shooting at 20 frames per second in continuous autofocus with a lock-on option, I will register a bunch of settings to recall when I am shooting static subjects. Okay, and so again, we looked at that with the portrait settings. You can also, if you're primarily a sports shooter, you could set up the AEL button for that as well. So you can shoot one shot of a cyclist who's stationary before the race starts, and then go into burst mode simply by releasing your finger off the AEL button. Same for bird photography, just shoot one shot at a time with a single focus point when the bird's in the tree, and then release and go into 20 frames per second wide lock on when tracking the bird in full flight. Okay, so as I said, I do like for sports to freeze subject matter, and there was a a technique that we did before we had these very sophisticated systems, and it did mean that we could use very slow shutter speeds. It's often a technique that we can't use when subject matter is traveling towards us or away from us, and that is simply to pan with a slow shutter speed. So I don't want to lock you into just using very, very fast shutter speeds. You can pan with quite slow shutter speeds, such as Dylan has done here with a 60th of a second. He entered this for a Sony Alpha award and headed up the category in this particular with this particular photo. Okay, finally let's turn our attention to movies. A lot of the AF systems become disabled when shooting movies. So I just wanted to cover sort of the focusing systems that I use when I do shoot movies. By default, I will typically set to continuous AF. Okay, so that's the first choice I'll make when making movies. And by default, I'll set the focus area to wide. There will be instances where I'll choose not to use wide, but by choice, I'll continuous AF. Wide will be my primary choices. I will set the AF drive speed to slow. This is when it changes its focus from one subject to another. I want the transition to be reasonably slow rather than to be very fast. It can be quite unnerving when people are watching videos for fast focus pulls. They might be appropriate for a music video where there's a fast beat, but for most instances, and Hollywood included, we'll do slow focus pulls between different subjects. And so I will set that up in the menu. I will, for this one, I will set up touch operation. I usually have touch operation switched off, but I will enable touch operation, so it allows me to use the monitor on the back of the screen and touch to acquire focus. And I will typically set up my C4 custom button to switch that on and off, because I typically don't like it on when I'm shooting stills. Okay, so when you're in wide and continuous and you've got touch enabled, if you just touch the back of the screen, you will go into spot focus. So continuous focus will be disabled temporarily. You can touch the icon that appears on the screen and come out and go back into continuous at a moment's notice. So you're basically toggling between continuous and spot focus as we work with that. Okay, so lock on AF with movies. Okay, so there is one option open to us if we need to lock on and have the focus track with a known subject across the frame, and we have to enable this. This often is the first iterance of lock on AF on the E-Mount cameras, which has been superseded on recent model E-Mount cameras, but we still actually use for movies. So you need to go in to your custom key settings and set a button for initiating center lock on. You'll also have to switch center lock on in the menus as well. Okay, and then when you click the center button on the camera, you'll be given the choice to switch it on. You will acquire a subject. You'll press the center button a second time, and the camera will then track that subject even when you're moving the camera or the subject moves. And pressing the center button again will switch the lock on AF off. And then you can reacquire a different subject if needs be. If you do need to use a flexible spot AF with movies, then it's a simple case of just using the multi-selector or joystick just to move that focus point. This is where the slow focusing transitions come into their own, because it won't be sudden, it'll be quite smooth and look deliberate. Okay. So again, just moving that focus point with the joystick, pulling focus in a different area of the scene. manual focus with movies. Obviously A7S2 users and A7S users will be using this as their primary focusing technique, and that is simply maybe to assign a button for magnify focus. It is possible to fine-tune focus while recording by magnifying a certain section of the movie so we can get critical focus. Okay, so this basically concludes my focusing masterclass. Hopefully you found some useful tips and techniques there. I know it's a lot of movie and we've covered a lot of ground. I will continue to answer questions in the comments below this movie. Okay, so if you're wanting to catch up with me at workshops, these are 2 workshops that I'm running in 2019 in USA. You can catch up with these events through World Photo Adventures. There'll be 2 photographers, Darren Leal and myself, Mark Gaylor, as your photography guides, and we'll be looking at great areas for landscape in North America. Will be those 2 separate workshops. They're consecutive, so join one or join both, and you can, if you like listening to me for an hour or and a half, then you will can listen to me for several weeks. And I generally fail to draw breath when you get me talking. You just keep asking questions and I'll continue to answer. So I'm Mark Gaylor, Sony Global Imaging Ambassador. Okay, thanks for bearing with me.